Vocation Lunch. And as I mentioned before, the Vocation Lunches provide us with an opportunity to recognize and celebrate vocational journeys of faculty and staff, to model called lives of service, and to build a sense of community rooted in Augsburg's institutional calling. When I think of our colleagues whose journey deserves recognition, who embody lives of called service, and who daily are building a sense of community rooted in calling, I can think of no finer example than Garry Hesser. Garry is a professor of sociology and the Martin Olaf Sabo Chair for Citizenship and Learning, specializing in urban affairs, city and metro urban planning, community-based research, just to name a few. He's been nationally recognized for his expertise in experiential learning, which is evidenced in his service as past president for the National Society of Experiential Education and the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs, better known as HECUA, as well as numerous other regional and national awards. Augsburg has benefited greatly from this expertise and contributions in experiential learning. Witness Co-op Ed, which resulted in an expansion of our internship programs, which resulted in an expansion of our service learning, which has resulted in a lot of national recognition that Augsburg well deserves, thanks in large part to the efforts of Garry Hesser. More importantly, we all know Garry is a dedicated teacher, a committed colleague, and a role model for what it means to be an engaged member of the community. So please join me in singing happy birthday to our birthday boy, Garry Hesser, and then welcome him to the podium.
Well, Nancy's been telling me she has most of my life with her. What are you going to cut? And I'm rapidly in my brain cutting as we go. I am so pleased and honored to be with you. Many of you have heard me say something along this line, that I wish that my life were somewhat patterned after Robert Frost's poem, "When I came to the fork in the road, I took the road less traveled, and it made all the difference." I fear Yogi Berra's version of that comes closer to me. When you come to the fork in the road, take it. Hopefully, the metaphor that I continue to mix by subtitling this invited in gives you a sense that when I look retrospectively at my life, at those forks in the road, it wasn't so much that I made a decision, but that I was invited in by some other institution or person. About 3 years ago, I explored my own Christian faith by going to the Benedictine monastery, hard as it is for you to believe, and went through a 9-day silent retreat. Upon returning from this Vipassana training, I turned to Thich Nhat Hanh, who offered another meditative approach that frames both what I'd like to share with you today, and I begin my days and end my days with it. Thich Nhat Hanh suggests that it would be well for us to bow in gratitude to at least 4 or 5. We have different versions at the end, he and I. But the first is to bow in gratitude toward your ancestors, those who biologically, literally gave you your DNA and your being. Secondly, to bow toward what we sociologists would call significant others, our teachers, our mentors, our current spouses, partners, colleagues. Thirdly, to bow to the founders of one's spiritual tradition and faith that one is born into, those who've carried it through the years and pass it on to oneself. The fourth bowing is to bow toward those who have invented the institutions and the structures that give us possibility and stability and a future. Those institutions of the political sphere, economic sphere, educational sphere. And then to bow, I add, and he had another version, to those who we never will know, we're unaware of, whose sacrifices and gifts, literally without our knowing, make life possible. Well, let me start with the ancestors briefly. If you walked over to Murphy Square, you would see a date, 1857. In 1856, my great-grandfather, Isaac Thomas Hesser, orphaned since the age of 8, and only 19 years old, was working as a hauler back and forth, a teamster. And they had a layover in Oskaloosa, Iowa. He caught the eye and the fancy of a young woman, 16 years of age, named Sarah Jane Fox. They left, and 2 days later he bartered for a second horse, rode back to Oskaloosa, and in 5 days negotiated with Sarah Jane and her parents and was married. I'm grateful for that miracle. 70 years later, his grandson, my father, a 19-year-old, needed extra money and food, and so he sold himself, if you would, as a dishwasher to the owner of the Dewdrop Inn in Enid, Oklahoma. The Dewdrop Inn proprietor had a daughter of 16, would you believe? Now, it took 5 years and not 5 days for those two to come together and make it possible for me to live. Without going too much into it, that romantic story is always underscored by the fact that the Dewdrop Inn proprietor would not have been there had she not had a husband who abandoned her and left her a single mother, necessitating her to move to the college town where her widowed sister had also started a business. I would not be here if certain people hadn't died early, making remarriages take place. So as I contemplate, if you would, ancestors, it's with those kind of memories that Thich Nhat Hanh helps me remember often on a daily basis. Family, church, neighborhood, these mark the next kind of stage. In 1942, my father, a grade school teacher of 5th and 6th graders and a principal of the same school, had a particularly frustrating year. As was necessary in those days, teachers had to find employment in the summertime because they were only paid for the 9 months they worked. And my father always had to haul the family somewhere else, and that summer he was emptying boxcars in Tonkawa, Oklahoma. Over dinner one night with his college friends who were well-placed in Conoco Oil Company, they said, "Benny, you don't have to put up with all of that. We can find you a job, we're sure, at Conoco Oil Company." And without my being part of the invitation, mind you, we were invited into a whole new world. Garry and his sister Linda moved from the southern part of Oklahoma with some of the worst and most underfunded schools in the South and the Southwest to a city, Ponca City, that had, without question, the best schools in Oklahoma, the best schools perhaps in the Midwest and the nation. That school produced 12 National Merit finalists in the first year that came online, to give you an idea. That move placed me in a neighborhood, in a church, that provided a whole set of extra parents that became particularly useful when my father was drafted in World War II. Those people showed me that parenting and families are not narrow, but expansive. And I continue, and we lost the last of those extra parents of mine just this last year. When Dad came home from the war, thanks to the government benefits, he qualified for a veteran's benefit, and thanks to a loan from the Dewdrop Inn mother-in-law, my dad fulfilled maybe not my mother's dream, but his dream to be a small farmer. And we moved to the country. And so I went from the neighborhood that was so comfortable, the church stayed constant, to being a farm boy in a 2-room country school. Nancy and I like to tell the story. There were 3 grades in the first year, all 6th graders, 1st graders, and 2nd graders, just because the numbers worked. There were 4 doors, and it was helpful to have each 6th grader sit at a door because there was a little 1st grader who tried to run away quite frequently. So I became a farm boy. And in that, exposed to a range of education and ethnic groups. The Osage Indians in that part of the state were the wealthiest people around. So the wealthiest people were Native Americans. The poorest people were many dirt farmers and people really on subsistence. But I had Mr. Brannon, Mrs. Stansberry, Mrs. Watson, who equipped us in that two-room school in ways that when we got to town, to the big school, I was tracked into what we then did with the college prep group even as a 7th grader and benefited immensely. All that time, and I'll kind of bracket it, there simply have been and always were a group of women. My mother, my sister, and Nancy. Just a story about my mother, who was the one who left college to marry my father after 2 years of college. You could characterize my mother as the kind of person who, as a Sunday school teacher and a director of Christian education, would approach me without much of a threat and say, I just found this book, Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ. I think you'll like it. With a kind of radical sense of this mother, at the same time hand me a book by an evangelical about converting people. I grew up with a mother of that kind who was always offering and inviting me into her ideas and to listen to mine. Beyond family, beyond the neighborhood, the 1950s for me also expanded this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant boy in a variety of ways, and let me just name two. My dad, I say as a vocation, really was called to be a scoutmaster, a Sunday school teacher, and a father. He gave his teaching up in order to make a living to support his family, but those were his calls. And so early on, I became a Boy Scout. I think I would have been asked to leave the family had I not. And Boy Scouting introduced me to some visionary guys who thought we needed to learn about Native American culture. And the best way to do it would be, would you believe it, experientially. And he and they formed something called the Odaponk Dance Team. In order for us to perform, we had to immerse ourselves as much as they would offer, and they did much, in the Ponca Indian community nearby. Thanks to the powwow this weekend, I was kind of reminded of this. The ancestors of White Eagle, a woman, not only taught me how to make these moccasins, but she and her family taught us how to dance. When I ran out of skills, she beaded on the back of 2 chairs this belt that I wore whenever I danced. And that invitation into another culture not only humbled me, because over the years I've discovered how much more I needed to learn about the oppression that was behind their lives, but invited me, and every weekend we could have danced for families and communities. And what an honor for those of us who had just been invited into this culture. In 1954, another event happened called the Supreme Court decision. Oklahoma was very clearly a Jim Crow state. In 1954, when the announcement was made in June, I got a civics lesson. The superintendent of schools, an active member of our congregation, quickly convened his board and the city, and within weeks, if not days, it was announced that the Ponca City Schools would integrate immediately for anyone who wanted to come, and completely in the following year. So in my high school experience, Bobby Walton, Booker T. Washington, thanks to athletics, became educators for me, inviting me into a world about which I knew very little. Thanks to another organization, the YMCA, a national organization that had something called Y-Teens, I had, by good fortune, become a state officer. And even before the Supreme Court decision in Oklahoma, the Y-Teens were the most integrated high school group, and I was treated again to friendships, stories in that community, well beyond what I deserved. Like any boy from the Hesser household, when it came college time, you went to Phillips University, a school very, very much like Augsburg, church-related, small, humble, struggling for its economic survival at all times. let me just highlight three people who, and there are, as you would know in a college, many experiences, but three professors who literally changed the course of my own direction. Richard Anderson, who died just this last year, taught me a lot about student and professor relationships. I was his grader. I was his TA. But Richard looked around and said, you guys need to learn a little more, and so let's pile in a car and drive before the days of interstate highways from Oklahoma to New York City and go to a United Nations seminar, something like Joe does with our students in the UN. That opened my eyes not only to New York City, which I fell in love with, but to the larger world of the United Nations. A second professor, a guy named Roger Carstensen, an Old Testament professor, would come thumping down the hall when I was grading papers, always with a joke. But one day he thumped down the hall and he said, Hesser, you're clueless. You're talking an awful lot about going the second mile, but you don't even have a clue about what the first mile is like. And Roger Carstensen turned me into a pioneer in service learning. He basically said there's a lot of people in nursing homes and the county home who get no company, who don't get shaved because they don't have time at the staff. You need to learn to do that. Let's do it. And so on a fairly regular basis, a fairly large number of us shaved old men and did other kind of basic services. Perhaps equally importantly to listening to their stories. And at 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning, we gathered in his office or in the classroom to talk about what does this mean, the so what. The third professor who shaped and directed my life was a philosophy professor who never quite finished his dissertation down in Nebraska. But he looked at a whole generation of us and said, you've grown up in Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado, you need to get out of here and discover that you can function elsewhere. So a whole generation of us went to and participated in graduate school, often in seminary at Harvard and Yale. But I was in love with New York City, so I went to Union Seminary. But these three folks, along with a whole lot of other wonderful experiences that introduced me to the sit-ins, the Peace Corps formation, and political activism that supported that through the National Student Association. But eventually I wound up in New York. And just to kind of highlight a couple of things, since I'm looking at the watch and the time is cooking, Union Seminary was an extraordinary place, the home where Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich had been just before I got there. I didn't chase them out. But my interest in the parish was revived. I was thinking I'd be a church historian. The day I almost arrived, it was announced that there would be a school boycott in New York City, and so we white folks were invited to help staff schools so that the schools could hear a message loud and clear from the black community about the quality of their schools. Then I got a strange phone call about halfway through my seminary career from the dean's secretary. There's a gentleman who would like a companion on Saturdays to drive up to Dutchess County to see his cows. And so for a year and a half, I was a companion to J.C. Penney. I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about the Golden Rule stores, is what he called them when they began. But mostly, I just was introduced to a gentleman who had deep convictions, who refused to foreclose on anybody, and basically lost all of his wealth during the Depression. Not exactly the experience I anticipated, but invited in once again. We were invited to participate and even create a civil rights group that stood 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from April until June, called the Seminarians for Civil Rights. When we saw that the legislation was bogged down, we didn't single-handedly change the world, but a student came up with the idea, and so we helped this happen. These were the kinds of things that I was introduced to in seminary. After graduating from Union, the parish had become interesting again to me, and I was lucky to land, again, invited in because my wife's former RA saw my resume in a big stack and said, "Oh, I know him." call it old boy, call it old girls network, but I suddenly wound up with an interview and went to South Bend. Gordon Cook, prominent doctor, son of a preacher in Kansas, but couldn't believe how the white community had completely ignored the black community for so many years and had become extremely active. He was Protestant, but he was treasurer of the Catholic Interracial Council, and he introduced me very quickly to people who, again, changed significantly my life by inviting me in, and I just named one particular couple. I'd floated into town, bought a house in 3 days, all based on an income similar to a beginning teacher's salary. At my first Fair Housing Committee meeting, I met a young couple, both social workers with a family income 3 times ours, who were still looking for a house after a year. It was those kinds of stories and invitations in that continued to transform and inform me about a world that I was much too protected from. Thanks to being in South Bend and being a part of those folks and having a mentor who helped me think through my own vocation, I decided it was time to find another way to make a living. And so I started applying to graduate schools and was in the process when, out of nowhere, thanks to friends and conversation at Notre Dame, I got a 10 o'clock night phone call from the head of graduate studies at the Notre Dame in sociology saying, "Are you going to apply? We have some very nice National Defense Education full-ride scholarships that we'd like to talk to you about." And almost by accident, I became a sociologist instead of an interdisciplinarian at New York University, where I could never get them to talk about money. The Notre Dame experience, like my South Bend experience, introduced me to Catholic priests and friends in conversation that again shifted my theology, my orientation, and my whole way of looking at much of the world. After finishing at Notre Dame, an invitation, again by accident, I went looking at I just stopped at my seminary to see, by the way, do you help anybody find placement work if they're going into college teaching and not the parish? And my old friend Sid said, no, but by the way, Glenn Bucher just stopped in an hour ago and they're looking for 3 sociologists at the College of Worcester. So there I was at the College of Worcester. One example that changed again my life because I was invited in. I'd hardly been at the College of Worcester a month, and into my office, as has always been the case, stomped 2 students, Margie and Don. Gary, you know this urban studies program that you're going to become the chair of? You send us off to Philadelphia and Detroit and Portland and San Diego, and then we come back to this little town, kind of like Northfield or St. Peter. What are you going to do with us? And so they talked me and my wife and 2 children into moving into student housing with them and creating what again made me a pioneer in service learning, a service learning house. We created a course on community, and every student was committed to organize at least one service, not just a project, but an enduring way to involve more Worcester students in that project. Well, we won't go into too much of the detail, but the years between 75 and 77 were challenging. And in 76 and 77, I needed another job and a new relocation for family. And out of nowhere came an advertisement in the sociology bulletin, and my best friend looked at it and said, "They wrote that for you." And here I am. In 1977, I arrived at Augsburg, and to use the metaphor that's been used, the table was set. Joel Torstenson had, a decade before, traveled around looking at urban colleges and universities, had written a paper called The Liberal Arts College in the City that I would to this day use in my consulting as a study document. And I arrived 10 years later, but that document resulted in a complete revision of the curriculum, an affirmation of our urban location as a teaching site, the possibility for up to 4 internships in every single academic department. This was not higher education as practiced anywhere. Certainly it had not been at Worcester. It took the University of Minnesota 20 years after that position paper to even approve academic credit for internships. I arrived at that table, and it's been a feast ever since. A couple of examples again to move toward a completion. I not only arrived at that table, but Vern Bloom and others had begun to teach courses at the Stillwater Prison and Shakopee Prison and the CHR program. The work they did resulted in basically metro mobility. I arrived at a place where people were way ahead of me, and it was all I could do to run to catch up and to enjoy that particular presence of inviting in. In 1980, Nancy and I had just finished building a house. My first wife, who we've been co-parenting with, died very suddenly. And Robin and her peers suddenly arrived with 2 cats who clawed instantly through our screens. And then a phone call came from Dick Green, the dean. Pat Parker, the associate dean, is going to have emergency surgery. Will you and Earl Arton share the associate dean's role for this coming year? Nancy still claims I never proposed, but she gets credit for inviting me in, and we got married in December, and I began as associate dean with her incredible support in January. The point of all that is that my assignment was to oversee internships, faculty development, and academic advising. And within a week after starting, I discovered that there was something called the Minnesota Cooperative Education Association organizing, having its first meeting in Red Wing. Bob Clyde and I went. We discovered that Gustavus and Concordia had been drinking at the trough of Title VIII money quite well, and Augsburg should too. We tried to throw together our first proposal, and you might guess it went down in a crash. I went off doing other things after that role. I had a faculty internship at the Council of Churches. We had a new baby at our house. And then, thanks to Bob Clyde's incredible persistence of writing and rewriting that proposal, it got funded. And a phone call came, and Dick Green said, "You're going to be the director, right? We always put your name and resume in each proposal." And I said, no, I'm ready to go back to teaching. And as has been her custom over and again, borrowed from her mother, Nancy said, "Gary, go back again and look with both eyes. When will Augsburg ever get this kind of resource?" And she was right. And you'll look over the shoulder of anybody who takes it, and you'll always be nitpicking them to death, so you better do it. And I did. And so, indeed, let me conclude by saying that it was that good fortune of Bob Clyde's persistence, other people asking me to look again, but because of the funding and the resources available, when I showed up as a faculty member who was tenured at the National Society for Internships and Experiential Education, with an institution that supported that, I was quickly invited to be on the board, not because I was me, but because I was from an institution that supported experiential education. And at the next board meeting I went to, they said, "Don't you want to become our president?" And I said, "You don't know me." And they said, "But it's time we had someone with faculty status, and you're here." And I don't want to make light of that, but it was that extra invitation in that made that prominence happen, and the continuing support of this institution that made it work. I really will quit. In addition to my family, which of course has been an incredible support over all these years in my own vocational pursuit, there have been at least 5 very special subgroups within this campus that have made the journey what it has been. the original sociology department, none of whom are here, who took the risk of hiring a stranger, the Metro Urban Studies faculty from across the whole campus in terms of departments, the Center for Global Education that I had kind of the good fortune in my associate dean days to help pick its early leadership and serve on its advisory board. Of course, the Center for Service Work and Learning, with its not stepchildren, but new offspring, called the Stroman Center, the Sabo Center, and invited to continue to play a role to help shape and co-create those particular places. And of course, the home that I walk to every morning. Not too many people are lucky enough to, and I don't bound as much as I used to, but walk up the stairs 4 flights and have a set of colleagues who both encourage, support, and represent the quality and the kind of teaching that will make this place what it is, an even stronger place. I'm a very, very, very lucky man. Let me conclude by a last gift from the global religious community, a gift that my son, who when he went to California Lutheran, brought of Namaste. If you know, in the Hindu tradition, the Namaste is, the sacred in me greets the sacred in you. Every one of the people and groups who've invited me in over all these years and shaped me at each fork in the road, consciously or unconsciously, I am convinced, looked at me as a gift that way, and even looked at themselves that way. And so to all of you, my dear friends in the Augsburg community, it is my dearest wish that you and I, into the future, in this community, greet and regard and function together in that same spirit. The sacred in me greets the sacred in you, and I thank you.